I want you to think back to 1999, to February 1999, which was the time when army leaders conspired to intimidate the population before the vote in September as to whether East Timor wanted to be independent of Indonesia, which had invaded and had occupied it. What happened was that the army armed or set up militia groups in each of the 13 provinces with the object of creating havoc if the referendum was lost, the UN referendum was lost by Indonesia, and if the vote went to independence. The chief conspirators were intelligence chiefs in the Kopassus Special Force, reporting to General Zaki Anwar, together with the East Timor's military governor, Abilio Soares, and the militia leader, Eurico Guterres. The collaboration between the Indonesian military and the freelance militias was obvious to all observers in the months before the referendum. They worked together quite brazenly. They were responsible for a series of massacres, including the one at the Quisha church, which killed, where 67 people were shot or hacked to death. And the purpose of this pre-referendum terror was to spread the militia's message. What's the point of voting for independence if you're going to be killed the next day? There could be no doubt about the certainty of a bloodbath after a yes vote, unless the UN put in troops on the ground to prevent it. But the UN didn't. It was opposed by Indonesia, and the vote was held on 30th of August. It was obvious that if the UN announced the result for independence, that that bloodbath would begin. The UN announced the result, 78.5% in favour of independence. Well, overnight, the militias and sections of the Indonesian army began to kill, loot, and scorch the earth. It's wrong to say that they ran amok, because there was method in their madness. Typically, first people to be killed were the intelligentsia and professional people rounded up and murdered. So the scorched earth policy forced 500,000 East Timorese to flee into the jungle. 130,000 were forced at gunpoint to West Timor. 14 Catholic priests and nuns were murdered in Dili, as well as the head of the Protestant church. Of course, this was in part because of negligence, responsibility of the UN for going ahead with the referendum when they must have known what would happen. But and it severely shocked Kofi Annan. He said, we can't stand by and allow the people of East Timor to be killed. But the UN Security Council did stand by for 8 shameful days, and America waited vainly for the defense chief, General Wiranto, to restore discipline. China made clear that it would veto any armed intervention. So with the block of China's veto, China was quite happy for 2 weeks for tens of hundreds, thousands of people to be killed in the slash and burn. And finally, of course, President Clinton did what he should have done at the outset. He threatened President Habibie with the loss of billions of dollars in loans unless he permitted a UN peacekeeping force to enter East Timor, and the Australian forces, with the Americans cowardly shrieking back in the rear, the Australian and English forces went in. Miraculously, without loss of life. The cowardly militias shrank into the bushes and across to West Timor. But nonetheless, they'd done their work, and East Timor was in ruins with buildings torched and the earth scorched by the Indonesian soldiers who had slunk across the border. So then there was the investigations, the finding of mass graves and so forth. and then a question of what to do about those who were responsible. The General Wiranto was allowed. I think the important thing to remember at this point was that Asian countries were opposed to any court. The obvious way to deal with it was for the international court system that had already covered Rwanda and the Balkans to be extended to cover these atrocities committed at a UN, after a UN referendum in East Timor. But Japan, China, India and the Philippines didn't want to embarrass Indonesia. They voted against at the UN a Human Rights Commission investigation. China made clear that it would veto any extension of the criminal court system to cover Indonesia. So the Human Rights Committee did set up a low-key investigation. Indonesia refused to grant visas for its members to enter West Timor or Jakarta to interview witnesses. But then, miraculously, of course, the transition to democracy in late 1999 in Indonesia itself brought a popular demand for human rights, and the Human Rights Commission, established by Parliament, appointed Munir and others to investigate, and that was when he discovered clear evidence of the massacres in East Timor, of how the bodies of the victims were rushed and transported across the border for secret disposal in West Timor. His inquiry called in and cross-examined generals and uncovered the conspiracy to arm the militias and to fund them from East Timor's civil administration budget. Munir's report in 2000 accused 33 leaders of crimes against humanity and demanded their prosecution under the command responsibility principle, which is the principle that although as a commander you don't know or approve of the crime itself, you are nonetheless responsible at a lesser level, but responsible nonetheless in international criminal law if you fail to stop if you refuse to stop the crimes and if you refuse to punish their perpetrators. That's the command responsibility principle that Munir's inquiry recommended. The Indonesian government rejected, of course, any kind of international court. A hybrid court suggested by the UN with Indonesian judges working with international judges was rejected, but it promised to bring the suspects to justice. Megawati, the next president, was put under strong international pressure to do that, and the trials at the Human Rights Court began in Jakarta in March 2002, not the 33 that Munir had recommended, but 18 military officers and militia leaders were accused of a crime against humanity by permitting widespread and systematic militia attacks on civilians, hundreds of whom lost their lives. General Wiranto, the leader, who should have been prosecuted under the command responsibility principle, was allowed to resign honourably from cabinet in return for an amnesty. There was an agreement not to prosecute him so long as he stood out of the way for a while. I think his desire for publicity soon came back, and he became a pop singer, I think, issued a pop song and stood for election. The Attorney General lacked the courage to prosecute Zaki Anwar, who in my view is most responsible, and the other serious senior army officers implicated in the killings. And of course, there was a little tribunal of international judges in East Timor that did convict the local militia members, quite a lot of them, 50 of them, but of course they were fairly small fry beside the Indonesian generals and the militia commanders. Well, people talk a lot about victor's justice. I think there's something called loser's justice. It began after the First World War when Wilson, the Americans, vetoed the idea of putting the Kaiser on trial for unrestricted submarine warfare and allowed the Germans to prosecute their own war criminals, submarine commanders who'd machine-gunned sailors in the water of the boats they sunk and so forth. And there were 800 of them, and they were put on trial at Leipzig, and 795 were acquitted, and 5 of them who were convicted were allowed to escape. So that loses justice, and Indonesia lost, and here was putting on, allegedly putting on trial in a human rights court these people. I don't think there have been some criticisms of the judges, whom I know I helped to train them before they took their place, and I thought that they displayed a great deal of courage and attempted fairness in the course of the proceedings. The guilt of for the failure belongs to the cowardly and incompetent prosecution and the corrupt appeals court. What happened was that 18 suspects were tried and 6 were actually convicted in the first instance. The 12 who were acquitted because the prosecutor, I think deliberately, presented insufficient evidence, so the court couldn't, acting honestly, convict them. And then we had, for example, we had the main defendant, who was a Major General, Demiri, the army commander of East Timor, was actually convicted after the prosecutor had begged the court to acquit him. It was quite extraordinary. The judges bravely convicted him, who were then abused by Demiri and the army and threatened, and the 6 who were convicted were all allowed bail. Demiri was allowed to go and lead the army in attacking the separatists in Aceh while he was still convicted and under sentence. And the appeals court, of course, acquitted them all. So that left only the only 2 from East Timor were Guterres, a military commander, and Soares, the ex-governor, who they got 5 and 3 years apiece, but I think they were then allowed on bail, and their sentences too never took effect. So the Jakarta war crimes trials provide a very good example of the kind of sham prosecutions that the International Criminal Court is entitled to disregard under what is called the complementarity principle. The ICC is a court of last resort where a country won't prosecute its own war criminals or prosecutes them in this sort of way, a sham prosecution. And it's regrettable that the world has drawn a veil over these inadequate trials. The Indonesian army was forgiven very quickly in the interests of having it lead the battle against terrorism after the Bali bombings. So the success of the Indonesian generals in avoiding international justice was complete, with one exception, and one takes heart from this, that they made no secret of their fears of suffering the same fate as General Pinochet, or the indignity that would attend their appearance in uniform in The Hague. There are lots of statements they made to the press and privately which indicates they were genuinely afraid, not so much from cowardice as from the humiliation that they would suffer to their own strange code of military honour if they were tried under the world's gaze in another country rather than in their own court. It was the fear of indignity of international criminal justice which is quite widely shared in many military circles. And it follows, I think, that the prospect of trial at The Hague does have some real deterrent effect. And of course the army and the militias behaved like the nervous murderer. When they heard of the fleet coming in, they transported corpses of their victims at great inconvenience, long distance, to bury them across the border. So international criminal law, for all the hot luck of its enforcement, has at least made people a little afraid, made generals fear humiliation. And so I think that's one thing that one can take a sort of heart from in the failure in East Timor. But of course the Jakarta trials were condemned, I should mention, in 2005 by a UN Commission of Experts. It described them, and I quote, as manifestly inadequate, principally due to a lack of commitment on the part of the prosecution. It recommended that Indonesia be given a second chance to investigate properly under international supervision, failing which a special UN court should be set up to try them. Well, that report was welcomed by all the NGOs, but the likelihood of that coming to pass is, I have to say, very limited now that the Indonesian law enforcement is concentrating on Islamic terrorism. One consequence, of course, of Indonesia's failure is that its army commanders continue persecution in Papua, and that I shall look at in a moment. There has been, I have to say, and should mention, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up in 2005. Again, I think, an attempt to evade international criminal courts. It was called the Commission on Truth and Friendship, but it was originally stemmed from an idea by Ramos Horta, who proposed a panel of eminent persons from all of Asia, not limited to Indonesia and East Timor, but Indonesia rejected that idea, set up a bilateral commission with only Indonesian and East Timorese commissioners. It had no power to compel testimony or to compel the production of documentary evidence. It would be unable to determine individual responsibility, and its president, chief chairman of the commission, had a bad track record with the army, and said the important thing is to give trust to the invitees that our invitation will not lead to any trial or the setting up of any tribunal. And it had the power to recommend amnesty. So it really seemed to be a device, as sometimes truth commissions are, to avoid prosecution.